This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Seneca Network from SupChina. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I'm your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader series, and I asked the librarian if they had any books on paranoia. She whispered, "They're right behind you." My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and people say he's a contrarian, but he disagrees. In this episode, John and I are talking about slang in Chinese. Interviews with Kyle Anderson, who speaks Chinese and a few other languages too. All this and more, let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you from Utah in the United States.
Hi everybody, my name is John Pasden and I am in the city of Shanghai, China. How's everybody doing?
All right, John, before we kick in today, give us a quick update on Shanghai. You're on lockdown, right?
Yeah, I've been on lockdown since April 1st. Haha, great joke. And we have enough food, so that's good, but it's, not fun. We're doing okay. Some people are having a much harder time than us, that's for sure. Like, especially people that depend on, working every day to have enough money to live. So, it's definitely a hard time for a lot of people.
And I think also those people who may not be so technologically inclined, find food and purchase that online, right?
Yeah, so old people can be very rough on them. And then, a lot of people either can't work online, so they can't work, or, like you said, they just have trouble getting food, so it's rough.
Well, all the best to you, John, and for everyone there in Shanghai.
Thank you. Okay, so today our topic is slang. Specifically, learning Chinese slang in your studies. Should you do it? When should you do it? How should you do it? That kind of stuff.
Chances are you use slang in probably your everyday conversation, but let's delve into this a little bit in Chinese about getting into slang.
Yeah, so when you think about it, slang is really nothing more than just new words. So if you think about like a rainforest where there's like all these new species of animals popping up here and there, and some of them just get wiped out to get eaten, a volcano erupts, and the whole new population of frogs is gone. Words are kind of like that too. So sometimes words pop up and they don't last long. Like maybe it's a slang that comes up during the Shanghai lockdown of 2022, and then that's over and it kind of disappears. But then some slang sticks around, and then eventually it becomes so entrenched in the language that it ends up in dictionaries, and then it's not slang anymore.
I think a good example of that, John, would be like the word selfie. That didn't really exist 10 years ago, but, now it's in dictionaries.
Yeah, I think a lot of us were hoping that word would not stick around, but it did.
I like that word. But there are a lot of other slang words which don't really stick around. And they're not just words, right? There could be phrases or sayings.
Exactly. And some of them, they kind of pop up in spoken language. But nowadays, a lot of this slang comes from the internet. So it's kind of weird because some slang appears online. You see people using it in these online conversations, but then they don't really say it much in their daily lives, either because the people they talk to wouldn't know what they're talking about. They have their own little, group on their online forums, or because it just doesn't really work when they speak face to face, like because there's English letters thrown in, or just because no one will understand them because it just sounds so weird.
I think it's no different than like jobs or whatever. Every industry or profession has its own unique vocabulary and words, but this is a little more different. It's not necessarily just tied to professions, right? It could be lifestyles, age groups, interests and focus areas.
All right, so that's the thing. So this is a multifaceted thing going on here. So when you have new slang, new vocabulary coming into the language, sometimes it's kind of confined to a certain age group, a certain generation. Sometimes it's confined to sort of a domain, like maybe art students or musicians or project managers in this one IT company, and then other times it's kind of confined to a physical, like a geographical location. So there are so many facets to it, and then most slang you just are never even aware of until it gets big enough that it kind of spills out into the mainstream, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I would even say for us as L2 learners, second language learners of Chinese, we're going to become even less aware of these things, right? Because these are typically more advanced words or things that you're going to be learning in the language, which can come and go pretty easy.
Right. So for a learner, if you're not in the environment and you don't have direct exposure to like new slang, then probably your best way to be exposed to it would be new movies, new TV shows, or some other kind of, like podcast or video type media. So it's possible to get it, but that's often not the kind of thing that you're really going to have much hope of getting exposed to until you're in the somewhat advanced levels of your studies. All right, now let's take this back to the idea of studying Chinese and then the role slang plays. So obviously slang can be a little bit annoying, like if you hear something and you want to look it up and it's not in the dictionary because it's slang. And that's not something we can really help you with. But what I want to do is talk about how slang kind of falls into three categories in terms of like usefulness and urgency of your studies. And I think Jared will probably recognize these three types from his own experiences learning Chinese in China. So the first one I want to talk about is you're not looking for it, and then you just keep hearing something. And so it comes to you. And it's like, I keep hearing this word. It's not in the dictionary. What does that mean? And then you ask someone and they tell you and you're like, oh. And then after that, you hear it all the time. And it's just like, bam, it's so easy to master because it came to you.
This is a really good point, John. I recall times of working in my bakery back in Shanghai that, that my staff would, later on, I found out over a process of times that they'd actually created some words or sayings to refer to different things that we had in the bakery and sometimes different processes that we did. And I thought that these were like words, and I remember once trying to train a new employee and tell them some things. And I was repeating just a couple of these words, and they were kind of like looking really confused. And I remember looking it up in the dictionary. I'm like, wait, this isn't in the dictionary. This isn't in Placo. Now, that was very specific, right? Okay, slang, this is more like an industry term. But yeah, there's been other examples like that I can think of, John, where it's like, man, yeah, you're just like, I understand I understand the meaning of what is going on here, but it's not something I can go teach someone else.
Yeah, and sometimes it happens face to face in conversation, and then sometimes it happens like in text, like in WeChat. So the internet version of it. But in both cases, it's kind of nice because it comes to you. You can easily confirm that, yeah, people say this, and you learn it, and then you keep hearing it, and it just becomes your own.
There was a dark side of this. I recall one time, there was this guy I was chatting back and forth with, and he sent me a message, and there was like these three characters. I mean, I just couldn't understand what he was saying. I put it through translators. I asked like two Chinese friends, and finally we determined it was just a typo. So it wasn't a new slang at all. It was just a typo.
Yeah, so typos are not new slang. That's something you have to watch out for. But anyway, let me move on to the second type of slang. So the second type is slang where maybe it doesn't come to you, but you have a friend or a teacher who's like, oh yeah, like nowadays we all say this, you should learn this. And so you would never come across it. And you're like, everybody says this? Like I use WeChat all the time and I never see this. And they're like, yeah, everyone says it. You need to learn it. And then you learn it. And then after you learn it, you see it everywhere. This isn't a phenomenon that's exclusive to slang, but it's especially noticeable for slang because you don't learn it in your Chinese textbook. You don't learn it in your HSK course or whatever. It's not in Placo, but then after you learn it, you see it everywhere.
John, I guess I could pontificate on why that is, why you don't notice it. But what it would be, I guess, more of your educated explanation of that.
Well, I mean, you don't really notice it because you don't know what it is. And then you can also often just rationalize like, oh, it means this. And your mind just makes up something. And if it's not some like totally bizarre type of word that really stands out, then it can easily get overlooked repeatedly.
I also think that sometimes, your brain is inclined to just gloss over or skip things you don't understand, right? You just kind of...
Yeah, especially when it's not really important. That's your brain trying to be efficient and just get to the point, right? Focusing on meaning. Okay, and then finally, the third kind, which is kind of a problem. The third kind is the slang where, you don't know it exists. You go out and you read about it, and you're like, huh, that's kind of interesting. And then, like, you never hear it. You have no way of using it. Or, like, maybe you use it once, and people are like, you know that word. And then, you never use it again. So slang like that can be can be tricky because was it really worth learning?
Not just that, it's also like, I think when you come across stuff like that, it's like, are you really using it correctly? It's like,
does anyone know?
Yeah, maybe nobody really knows, or maybe it's like people in a very focused area or this type of lifestyle or whatever would use that word.
Yeah, and just keep in mind that a lot of these slang terms, they're not around forever. So if you spend a lot of time learning really obscure slang terms, like number one, you better be pretty advanced, because if you're not advanced, you're ignoring a whole bunch of really important stuff. And then two, like, is it really worth the time? Like, if you really love it, okay, but if you don't really love learning about slang, then there's probably more, effective ways you could be using your time to learn your Chinese and improve your fluency.
One other thing I'm mentioning about using slang is that it's just not always about knowing the word and being able to use it correctly. I think a lot of slang also is in the delivery. In my reference, of course, here is the United States, but, if you took someone from, South Central LA and you put them in Wichita, Kansas, how they might speak and the slang that they're going to use is going to be very different, and maybe have a hard time connecting with, people they would meet. So it's the accents and the whole candor and the cadence and, there's a lot of things that are baked into using slang. It's not just the language alone.
And you have the added complication that people from LA, their slang shows up on TV and in movies, but the slang that shows up on TV and in movies is a little behind because there's a lag, right? So then you have this weird effect of like other parts of the country knowing the LA slang, but it's the LA slang from like a year ago or 2 years ago. And so it's this weird mishmash, and it happens in China too. Okay, so we just talked about like 3 different types of slang. The slang that comes to you, the slang that you look for and find, and the kind that is like treasure hunting, like it's super rare and you may or may not get to ever actually use it. And so what I want to just talk about really quickly is what level you are and then how this is relevant to your level. So if you're a beginner, elementary, this range, then that would be roughly the first kind, where if the slang doesn't come to you, it's not knocking on your door and bothering you, then you really don't need to spend a lot of time seeking out slang. You should really focus on the absolute basics.
Good practical advice.
And I'm sure you can guess what's coming next. If you're intermediate and you're interested in slang, and maybe you spend a lot of time on WeChat, chatting online, maybe you're starting to try to understand a few TV shows or something, well, then that's where seeking out some very common, useful, general usage type slang can really pay off, and it can make the language kind of come alive. It's like this little spice that makes everything more lively and more interesting.
Well, John, what about the third kind of slang?
I think you've probably figured that one out, Jared.
Could it be, John, that this advanced slang is something that's more appropriate for advanced learners?
The obscure slang, right?
That's right, obscure slang.
All right, well, see, here's the thing. Like, yes, if you're advanced, then you're definitely best suited to seeking out the more obscure slang and actually making use of it. But that doesn't mean that just because you're advanced, like, you have to learn all the slang, right? You can't learn it all. And keep in mind that so much of it is just going to slowly fall out of usage. So, like, you kind of got to make a call. How much time do you want to spend on that?
Yeah, I think something that's important is keeping this in perspective with your own native language. Obviously, you do not know all the slang in English or whatever language your mother tongue is. You're going to be out of the loop and when you're put in certain situations. And so I think, when you're really, if you want to try to learn slang, it's like, hey, comes back to just some of the basics of like learning the language, of like, what's relevant to you? What are you actually going to use? What are you going to encounter? So if you're going to be working like in the restaurant industry or whatever, and you can learn words that are going to be used in a restaurant, and it's not just restaurant, there could be slang that are particularly pertains to that. And there's all sorts of slang that's going to be, if you're watching a lot of movies and shows and stuff like that, there's going to be slang that's going to be pertaining to all those different types of genres and different type of situations that you would talk about in Chinese.
Yeah, and there's also this issue of authenticity, right? Like, take, for example, English, American English. All right, so Jared and I, we're no longer, spring chickens. We're not in our 20s. We don't go around calling stuff lit and saying no cap. Like maybe we've heard this new slang, but it's just not our generation.
Hey, you don't.
Yeah.
You don't, John.
Yeah, Jared tries really hard.
Right.
But it's not our generation, and it's going to come across as a little inauthentic if you start trying to use the slang that really isn't your group. And of course, the same is true for learning Chinese. I mean, if you're 50 years old and you're trying to learn how the 20-year-olds, talk at the gym, I mean, I guess if you're at the gym all the time, maybe it makes sense, but in a lot of cases, it's just not going to make sense, right? It's not authentic.
Absolutely. And this gets back to, I'm saying, what is relevant to you. And so you don't try to be something you're not. Like I said, that's going to be like the guy from Central LA showing up in Wichita, Kansas, and trying to use all the slang that he's familiar with.
All right, and I think we've hit most of the good advice here for learning slang, but I just wanted to give one example of a slang term which I've seen rise and fall while I've been in Shanghai, and it's kind of cool. So that term, and I'm sure you know it too, Jared, is 给力.
Uh-huh.
And literally it means like give power, but it means like, support. And I remember, I think it was 2010, because it was the year I started All Set Learning. But in 2010, it was everywhere. Not only was everyone saying it and everyone using it like a crazy fad, but it was appearing in ads. I feel like every company was like, oh, this word is so hot, we have to use it in our ad. And it was getting like super annoying. And so it was everywhere. And so I was really wondering, is this new slang term really going to stick around? And so what happened was that it kind of burnt out. Like it was too hot and it definitely faded. But it never disappeared. And so 给力 is definitely a word you still see, but it's not like a hot slang term anymore. It's just this word that kind of eventually found its place. And so it's one that is worth learning. It was once very hot and everywhere, but it's no longer that case. But it didn't fade away. And if it's not in dictionaries now, it will be eventually because it's not going anywhere. So that's an example of, kind of the life cycle of a slang term in Chinese.
And I will say, John, that is a Category 1 slang term for me. 2010 is when I moved to China, and I started hearing that word. And I'm like, what is this? And it found me. And
awesome. You looked it up, and it wasn't in the dictionary, right?
Well, actually, since it became so popular, it wasn't in the dictionary at the time, but I was able to find it online and get an explanation of it. But I think even before I did that, I'd asked like a Chinese coworker. I'm like, what is this? I'm seeing this everywhere.
Yeah, it's actually 2 characters, which are quite simple as well, so it's pretty learner-friendly.
But I think this also brings up an important aspect about all of this slang, is that it has a shelf life, if you will. Right? There's a lot of these can be like fads that they come and they go real quick. And so I think, is another aspect. If you really want to try to like learn slang and stay on top of it, well, even if you're really studious, your window of opportunity to use that word may not just be constricted to who you're speaking to, but also a very specific time frame. And it could be as little as just a couple of months.
But remember, Jared, some of it does stick around. Like 给力 kind of really did join the ranks of real vocabulary. But some of it, 5 years later, no one even remembers it. And so one thing you can do is you can look up online, top internet slang from 2015 or whatever, and you can see how ask your Chinese friend, your Chinese teacher, no one uses any of these words anymore, and they'll just laugh because they're so weird and obscure. But there will be a couple that are still around.
And on that note, I'll give a quick shout out as well to Slow Chinese. We had Andrew Methvin on our podcast a few episodes ago, but yeah, he does this. He actually researches the top slang that's going around on the internet, and he publishes a weekly newsletter about it.
Right. So a lot of those terms will be around for the long haul, or maybe they're kind of domain specific. And then some of them won't be surprised if they're not around in a couple years.
And frankly, I would venture to say it's going to be 95% of these things aren't going to stick around. They're not going to have a long shelf life. It's just a few that really do stick around.
But a lot of it's super interesting. So if you like linguistics, you like Chinese, still worth reading about.
Well, John, I got to say, I really do enjoy using slang when I can get it right. But I think also one of the big challenges is that, I'm not in China anymore. And so I don't have that opportunity to use slang all that often. And so, John, how often do you use slang in your everyday conversation?
I don't know, fairly often. But I do kind of stick with the ones that I know are, more well established. I don't go for the vanguard slang or whatever. Avant-garde.
The avant-garde slang. All right. Well, I appreciate that, homie.
All right.
Homeboy.
Anyway, hopefully that's useful to you guys and you, slang heads.
Slang heads. I think that's a new fad, John.
Yeah, I'm trying hard here.
All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. And today our sponsor is
Mandarin Companion, Chinese graded readers. These are easy-to-read Chinese stories, guys. You might have heard of them.
Today we're talking about our level 1 graded reader, Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Curly-Haired Company.
All right, so this is based on a Sherlock Holmes story, which is really about a red-headed league, but our story is about a curly-haired company.
This was a lot of fun to adapt this story. We don't have redheads in China, but there are curly-haired people, and they're about as uncommon as redheads would be in the West, in most areas.
So this is a fun story. You only need 300 characters under your belt to be able to read, understand, and enjoy this story because it is level 1.
And this is also one of our perennial favorites. It's one of our best-selling novels of all time. It's a great story.
And there's also something really special about this one, which is it has a prequel in the breakthrough level, 150 characters. And then this is level 1, which is 300 characters. And there's a level 2 Sherlock Holmes story coming.
That's right. Believe it or not, guys, we are publishing a new book. Woo!
All right, so our Sherlock, his name is Gao Ming, and we hope you guys really enjoy it. So the one that is level 1 is called Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Curly-Haired Company.
So you can go out and get it today on Amazon, iBooks, Kobo, or wherever you get your books. All right, now it's time for rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
I have a rave, and it kind of starts with a rant almost. Like in Shanghai, when you live in one of these high-rise apartment buildings, you have all these neighbors on your floor, and it's kind of weird how people hardly even talk to their neighbors in Shanghai. Like, everyone is so distant, and like even your next door neighbor, you might never talk to them, and that's normal. But here's the rave part. With this whole lockdown thing, where some people are running low on food and people are having problems, like the whole building community has really come alive. Like, everyone is joining these building WeChat groups. Everyone's communicating. People are dropping off food. Whoever needs it, they're helping each other out. I'm not going to name any names or anything, but some of us are even conspiring to figure out how to take our dogs out without doing anything dangerous and without getting busted, because who wants to make their dog poop inside their apartment, right? So anyway, There's always a silver lining with these kinds of things, and it's really cool watching the Shanghai apartment communities come together. And I know it's not just my building. I'm talking to other friends across the city, and everyone's noticing the same thing, so that's kind of cool.
That's really cool. That's really cool to hear, John, because, I definitely can relate that. I think, as you've said before, that Shanghai apartment dwellers are notoriously not unneighborly, but they're just not connected, right, with one another.
They're distant.
Distant. That's a big good word. That sounds really cool, though. A positive externality of the pandemic lockdown.
Yes, there are a few. All right, so Jared, how about you? Rant or rave?
John, I have got a rant. And this has to do with the new Marvel show, Moon Knight. Now, in episode 2, it's so far it's great. I'm really enjoying it. My family's enjoying this show. But in episode 2, there is an atrocity. I mean, it is of galactic well, not galactic, but it's really bad, John. Okay, they are purportedly speaking Chinese in one scene of episode 2. Now, I've actually got it here, so let's listen to this, John. You ready?
Oh, boy. Yes, I remember this scene.
Chisalela, Wakanida.
你还是个熟的。
Listingla, Jamela. Listingla. You all speak Chinese? Mandarin. We all...
Mandarin. What was that? Oh my gosh, John! What is that?
It's like the writers and the actors have never even heard Chinese before in their lives. Doesn't sound remotely like it.
你好，shukashu. Ah, ni sting la. What on earth? I mean, honestly, John, when I went back and I like listened to it like 4 or 5 times, like what just happened there?
Me too. Yeah.
And I'm honestly, first off, my impression was like, okay, maybe they're speaking like a dialect. I mean, you know, I would say we're a little more aware of that, so I wasn't ready to jump all the way head first into a conclusion. But I mean, I went back and listened to it. I'm like, this is just bad. This is wrong.
I'm pretty sure ni hai is supposed to be ni hao, but that's about all I can get out of it.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. So there are some Chinese subtitles that you can turn on, and evidently he's supposed to be saying like "ni gan shima." You know, they're like, you know, saying, well, let's, and evidently he's saying like, let's fight together. I think is what some people are saying the translation is supposed to be. Anyway, it was just terrible. I'm like, this is an embarrassment. I mean, this is out by Marvel, who put out Shang-Chi, right? I mean, that movie was like like a fourth of it was like in Chinese.
Different team working on this one.
I was like, this just an embarrassment. I mean, they can't go back and like reshoot that at this point or anything. But
actually, this reminds me of an old episode of The Big Bang Theory where Sheldon was supposedly speaking fluent Chinese, and it's hilarious because it's also bad, but it's just good enough that you can figure out what he's trying to say. I once wrote a blog post about it, but yeah, this one is not. It's not on that level even.
Yeah, I refuse to believe that somewhere along the production of this episode that there wasn't some Chinese speaker, who could have been involved or pulled in to at least provide some sort of level of language coaching on this. Because, like, even if they had just pronounced it horribly, you know, it would have been okay. But like, it was like, hey, let's put this through Google Translate, and you know, just read this. I don't care what it sounds like. Just read it.
I gotta say, I'm disappointed in Ethan Hawke. Come on, Ethan. Come on.
Seriously, I know he puts a lot of effort into his roles, but oh well. So okay, that's my rant, John.
All right, it's a good one. Good one.
Ni hai shakashu.
My name's Kyle Anderson, and I'm a Vice President of Strategic Programming at a company called Academic Programs International out of Austin, Texas. And I was a professor and administrator in American colleges and universities before that. And all along that time, I've been an author and a writer, a translator, and doing some of my own poetry and fiction too.
All right, Kyle. Why did you start learning Chinese?
2 main reasons. One has to do with personal interest, and one has to do with a family connection. So my brother lived in, let me be more precise, it was pre-1997, so he was in Hong Kong at the time.
Okay.
And he was there for a couple of years, and I was in high school at the time, getting really interested in the Stoics and philosophy. And my father, he had a big library in our basement with all sorts of world classics. No Asian books, though, right? Nothing about Asian philosophy. My brother comes back from living in Hong Kong for a couple of years. He had heard, because we've been corresponding in letters to each other, found out that I was very interested in philosophy now. So he dropped a stack of books about Taoism in front of me. I'd never heard of Taoism. I was 17. I said, okay, this is going to be the next stack of books I devour. And I just slowly went through the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, and I was just smitten. I loved it. It answered a lot of questions I had about life and reality and the contradictions of passivity and quietude and ambition and all of those things, right? So I became fascinated. That's when I started to get really interested in Chinese culture. So that's the familial connection. And then the personal one came when China started to get on the rise. This was early 2000s. And I was in all sorts of literature classes at university. We're talking about all of these world classics, these theories of literature and things like that. And I kept on thinking, where's the Chinese? Where's the Chinese? Or it's the oldest continuous classical civilization in the world. Debatably the most rich literary tradition, right, in the world as well. And I was like, where is it? And then I came across a book. And for any Sinophiles here that are listening, read anything by Zhang Longxi. He was a former Stanford professor. He ended up in Hong Kong. But he wrote a book called The Tao and the Logos, where he basically just compared ancient Greco-Roman and Chinese philosophy and literature. Oh, and it was just awesome. I loved it. It built upon all the stuff that I had become fascinated through the books that my brother gave me. And that's when I realized that, oh, there are ways that you can make comparisons and think about these commonalities between Eastern and Western traditions. And so it's those two things. I said there was two factors, but there's an asterisk. I wanted a challenge. I'm a person that's always up for a challenge.
There we go.
I'd done a few European languages at the time, loved them, but I was kind of getting bored with them. And I started to dabble in Chinese classes on the side as I was finishing my degree.
How many languages have you learned at this stage?
I think I've studied at least 10. I get this question a lot from people when they find out I know a few languages. So, how many do you know? And I always say, well, the best way to answer that is how many I use daily. Right? And so daily I use about 7 or 8.
Wow, really?
Right. In the morning I read the news, but I read it in 5 languages because I want to know what's going on.
Wow.
Also do a little bit of my own philosophy, spiritual study, and that's in Latin, in classical Chinese.
Wow.
So I'll read the Tao Te Ching and I'll read some Seneca and sometimes the Bible in Latin, right? More like medieval church Latin. And you pile those all together and then it runs into 7 or 8.
Well, what point did you say like, oh, wow, I'm good at learning languages? What point did you come to that realization?
I mean, some people have that kind of self-awareness. I think it's usually other people that tell you. Right? I'd heard it enough that I'm like, yeah, you're right. This is a little easier for me. I wasn't in high school. I got to tell you, I took French classes and couldn't stand them, and I ended up dumping them and taking a civics class instead. That was more interesting to me. It wasn't really till college age. I had spent some time in Europe, in Italy. I finally found out that when I let my love for learning about people and their culture and their civilization lead for me, then the language came naturally. Some people, it's the other way around. They're more linguistic. They're more just fascinated with the language itself. I'm not. For me, it was philosophy. That was the initial hook. With Italian, it was fascination with architecture, fascination with the visual arts, and then fascination with just who people were, and I wanted to get to know them better, right? So it's very human, cultural reasons. And so I picked up Italian really quick. The Italian cities are a lot like North American cities where you have a lot of Latino populations that have immigrated there. Met a lot of Latinos, and then I started to be able to pick up Spanish really quick.
Oh, wow.
And I had some friends that were like, I don't get it. Like, what are you doing? They're like, what are you doing in your spare time picking up Spanish? This doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, well, if you want to talk to people, don't you like have to know their language? Like, what's wrong with you guys? Like, I started to realize that, oh, maybe it's much more of a chore for people than it is for me. It's still work, right? And I think everyone needs to hear that. When you ask me what languages I know, I didn't answer by saying I have this weird talent and I speak all of these. What my answer was is I do this every day.
Mm-hmm.
So I still got to do stuff, but I know that I probably have an aptitude for it. Yeah.
Also about this then is like you really attract to Chinese through the channel of philosophy, right? And some of the great thinkers in Chinese literature. But I didn't hear in your story there that, oh, there were these Chinese people or there were maybe some people I'm really trying to connect with. Here you're the Italian, the Spanish thing, I'm connecting with people. But now this is a little different. We're talking about literature, ideas, and philosophy. What was that actually like leap to say, okay, I'm going to learn Chinese and much less because I know when you're trying to read philosophy in Chinese, classical Chinese, that's a whole different ballgame, right? What kind of happened there?
I'm going to be honest with everybody. I hit a wall. So sure, I picked up first, second year Chinese real quick. And then I hit a real wall because my literacy kept on increasing and growing because I would just read and acquire characters. But I didn't have that motivation to really practice my speaking. Like I need people because I feed off their energy and I learn from them. So I actually just said, I've got to go there. When I went there and started to meet people, well, there we go. Now I started to have my oral breakthroughs, my Koyu breakthroughs where I started.
Was this like a long term? Was this like, I'm just going for a week?
Okay, so here's the caveat because I know the CEO that I work for and everyone in the industry that I represent is going to hear this. So this was during SARS, and I knew that my study abroad is going to be China. These European languages, they're fine, but I really want to go to China. I got to make my breakthrough. SARS hit, they canceled the program. Now, I had already had a lot of international experience. I was headstrong and stubborn. I bought my own ticket and lived in Beijing on my own.
Nice.
With lower intermediate Chinese. And literally, I was living at a Chinese hostel. And back in the day, there's foreigner hostels and locals. I shouldn't say this.
No, that's okay.
But
There's still hotels like that today. Just for anyone listening, like the Chinese regulations are when you go to a hotel, they have to scan your passport so they know where foreigners are staying. And not all hotels or hostels are set up to do that. So foreigners can't stay there. So
that's right.
All right, kick it off.
But those are the best ones to stay in, man, if you're trying to learn Chinese and learn about China. So I was staying in one of those places near Tanronting Gongyuan, I think it was called. But it was a smaller park, not one of the big parks in Beijing. And basically just living out of there. And I was doing the thing that people who have already learned a language know how to do. Once you've learned a couple of languages, it's like muscle memory for an athlete or a musician who learns other instruments or other sports. You kind of know how to acquire the next ones. And I'm like, okay, all I got to do is go talk to the dudes in the park, go talk to the guys in the taxis, go to the merchants because they have to talk to you.
Yeah.
Because they're a captive audience for 8 to 10 hours. Right? And so that's what I did. I made a friend who was an antique seller at the Old Pearl Market.
Oh, I remember that. I've been there.
That's basically what I did. That and some sightseeing for a month on my own. And 2 or 3 weeks straight, I was just basically hanging out with the same merchant who we were just talking about family and life and all that stuff. And that was my breakthrough. That was my immersion. I don't advise, right, that every student take on that kind of risk during a global pandemic. But I was someone who always had a high risk tolerance. This was that pivotal moment for me in my Chinese language learning. I knew if I wanted to do anything with it in my life professionally, I had a very small window before I graduated to kind of get that intermediate fluency.
Well, what was that like, though? Most people's experience, first time coming to China, you're trying to struggle to say anything and like, these people speak so fast, right? I mean, surely you must have encountered experiences like that.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. The formula to success is smile and laugh at yourself in front of other people. And that softens everyone up and everyone's willing to work with you. So I think having that good sense of humor, a bit of humility, and ability to laugh at yourself, and people will work with you along the way. And the kind of things that people tell you to do, let's even say in your mother tongue, right? So one of the formulas to success, if you don't know what someone's talking about, ask them, right? If someone uses a word you don't know, ask them, right? Because that is your next step of learning. When someone uses a word I didn't know, I'd say, what does that word mean? Don't be afraid to say, hey, what does that mean? Or you said this. I don't quite understand that. And then everyone circumlocutes and chooses a different way to say it. And then you get it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, what did you feel like you got out of that 1 month? That's not a long time, but it sounds like you were also very intensive.
Confidence.
Really?
Confidence. That's what you got out of it. You know, every language learner knows that confidence tends to be that elephant in the room or that invisible gorilla blocking you from making it to the next level. And that could be just a lack of confidence in your speaking, could be shyness, it could be you don't want to look silly, right? It's all those blocks, all those psychological blocks we have. I also taught Chinese at universities, and one of the things I always tried to do was get students in an uncomfortable situation, not because I'm mean, but because they had to learn how to overcome their feelings of discomfort in order to thrive, right? And so one of those truisms is the most successful people are those who fail the fastest, right? Not those who succeed the fastest. They fail the fastest. Yeah, that's confidence is key.
Well, where did you go from there? You spent a month in China, did your own study abroad. I mean, did anyone know about this?
No, the school didn't know about it, and there was no credit associated with it, so they didn't care.
To me, really, that tells me how important this was to you, right? Because I think a lot of individuals, may just say, oh, whatever. Now, I can't even equate that to our current COVID situation because you just simply can't get visas right now to even go if you wanted to. But a lot of people just kind of given up. Oh, well, it's just not happening this year. But you charted your own course, right? I get an idea what you're talking about. It impacted your confidence, and it definitely helped proficiency speaking. But what kind of course did that chart for you for your future learning?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would say if I hadn't done that on my own, the next 15 years of my life would have been different.
How so?
I went to grad school. I became a professor and an administrator in study abroad, and then ended up where I am now with this company that supports study abroad and other high-impact practices around the world. I might have still done all of that, but Chinese wouldn't have been a part of it. I really needed to feel like I could do this. I could speak the language. I could pick up a book. I could pick up a newspaper. I could make it part of my teaching and research agenda. If I hadn't had that experience, I wouldn't have had another opportunity in my undergrad to go to China. That was the window. It really did set the path for what I've done in the past 20 years, I'd say.
What are some of those key events or experiences you've had along the way?
So I did my PhD at Penn State. What languages was still up for grabs in grad school. One of my advisors was Taiwanese. He was actually a Shakespeare scholar in China. So he did the appropriation of Shakespeare in the Chinese-speaking world. He's really quite well known. He kept on encouraging me at the time to pursue it. But at that point, I felt intermediate, right? Solidly intermediate. But I'm like, I'm not there. I only spent a month in Beijing. So what I did while I was a grad student is I applied for a few grants and I got them. And it allowed me to go to Taipei and to Taida, the national university, very well known in Asia. And they have what was at the time and what still is, I think, one of the best Mandarin language schools in the world. It was set up by Stanford in the 70s. And everyone there is basically either from the State Department or from top 20 universities in the United States that are studying there. And it is intense, man.
Really?
I don't know if you've known anyone who's gone to ICLP. Intense. And it's sort of the old Confucian method. There's a little bit of conversation, but you're having to read dozens of pages of academic Chinese, memorizing hundreds of technical terms. You have 3 or 4 classes that require you to do that. It was intense, but it was really good because everyone there was really good. And our teachers were fantastic, wonderful people. I looked up to them a ton. And then there was one teacher in particular. She was a little bit looser, more street Chinese. And I needed that. My academic Chinese was great, but I couldn't speak to anyone in the jiaozi shops. At one point, I was just like, what is my problem? I can pick up this book and read it, right? But I can't have a 3-minute conversation with this lady at the jiaozi shop. But this instructor name was Delia Chow, right? Delia Chow. She's fantastic. She was one of these teachers that just wouldn't put up with you at all. She wouldn't take any crap from me. And so if I was misbehaving or being cheeky or whatever, she'd call me out in class, but she did it in a really funny way. She taught me all sorts of colloquial phrases that I was always stopping and being like, what are you saying right now? Like the one I remember, she would always say 2 things about me that says something about my personality. She'd be like, 安凯的你想了太多你知道吗 you think way too much. Because I would always pester her with questions and she'd be like, look, it's not that complicated. Let's not get into it. And so she would always be like this. She'd be like, 你想了太多. You think way too much. My favorite phrase that I learned from when I would persist, she'd finally just get exasperated, throw her hands up and say, 气死我. I remember the first time I heard 气死我. Like, what does that mean? She's like, you're driving me crazy. And then the next phrase was my favorite. She said, 要弄坏你的老师吗? You want to break your teacher? Do you want to make me quit my job? So I love Delia Chow. I mean, I was in Beijing for a month before that. But having that intense formal experience, again, living in the city, in a big city in Taipei by myself, having great teachers, that was really formative for me. I fell in love with the ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity of Taiwan. It's a fascinating island with rich history, from European invasions to Polynesian inhabitation, right? 26 different Polynesian tribes that have inhabited the center of that island for so long. And we made a lot of trips down to the center of the island to visit those canyons, wonderful canyons and jungles and mountains where all the tea is made. So it's just a wonderful place. And I fell in love with the diversity. And I took that sort of view of Chinese civilization, let's say, writ large, to the mainland when I went back. So when I was in Beijing that first time, I didn't know the difference between a Han and a Hui. It was just I was in Beijing. It was Beijing. What I learned from Taiwan is, there's a lot more going on. And so when I went back to China, I got really interested in southern China and the interior. So then that takes me to Guilin and Yang, and I would say that's when I was a teacher. So I become a professor of Chinese, started up a Chinese and Asian studies program at a small liberal arts college in Kentucky called Center College. It's not quite a national brand, but they're one of the top schools that does study abroad. 85% of their students study abroad, and like half of them do it twice. And they brought me in to really root in a focus on Asia. When they hired me, there were a couple of historians who had taken some of the students to Shanghai and Xi'an and Beijing. The Bermuda Triangle of foreigners visiting China, from which we never emerged.
You go to see Beijing, Shanghai, and the Terracotta Warriors. They don't even remember Xi'an sometimes, right?
That's right. And the people that only do that always come back to me and say, yeah, I've done the China thing, checked, I'm not interested in going back. And I'm like, that's because you stayed in the Bermuda Triangle of China. Anyway, we're really passionate about Chinese. They were going to go on their study abroad program in Shanghai. And we had some funds and they had some time. And so I said, I'm afraid that you're just going to stay on the Bund, right? And you're going to stay in the center of Shanghai. You're going to go clubbing and you're not going to see anything else. So we're going to leave a week early before you go to your study abroad. And I'm going to take you to Yangshong Guilin. So any kung fu movie or any movie we've ever seen, any fantasy movie, didn't have to be about China. This is the beautiful southern areas of China with the beautiful Karst mountains and the rivers. And I took them there. We biked through all these places. We ate the authentic food with roaches the size of your hand scurrying by your feet. I remember that was we were doing hot pot.
It's a rite of passage there.
I told a couple of the students, don't tell the girls in the group, don't tell them to look down, don't look down. And it's a huge cockroach. You can just imagine. I'm not exaggerating. It was about the size of my hand. So it was like coming across the floor. And I was dying. And finally one of the girls noticed that I was trying too hard and looked down and yeah, and we did the river boats and it was great. They really appreciated it. And so when they did their Shanghai experience, this gave them the confidence and permission to go back. And they did. And they went and saw other places on their own. Why? Well, because someone opened the door for them. And so that was meaningful to me because the one thing I tried really hard to do as an instructor of Chinese was to not take the easy route of just sharing the common touch points, right?
I really appreciate that. There's times where I've talked to people and it's like, oh, I've been to China. Oh, great. Where have you been? I'm like, I came to Shanghai or I went to Beijing. I'm like, you didn't see China. You saw Shanghai. You saw Beijing,
Right.
And it's amazing, and you're staying in some 5-star hotel and, you're carted around every place to see all the amazing lights and everything. But, you miss out on that little hole-in-the-wall restaurant. You miss out on how people live their lives and a wet market and, all these things that are core elements, I would say, of just normal Chinese life. Yeah, you miss out on a lot of that.
Yeah, so that was meaningful to me. And, even in all my classes, it's been 10 or 15 minutes talking about some aspect of Chinese culture that wasn't the norm. Could be anything from Chinese heavy metal, right, to some Mongolian throat singing or something like that. It was something that I wanted them to see how rich this culture was because quite frankly, because of the way global politics and international relations and media coverage works, we only get a pretty, if we're lucky, dual-faceted look at China. And it's just not fair. To the Chinese, it's not fair to the rest of the world. So
I always hesitant to say China experts, right? But, people like in your position, you're saying, hey, don't look at China as a monolithic entity. If you think we're American, right? America, we have 330 million people, but it's pretty diverse. You go from one corner to the other. It's, different mindsets, culture. But now you got China, 1.4 billion people. It's incredibly diverse.
That's right. What makes you think that a nation 4 size the times of yours is going to have figured out how to be monolithic when you can't? It's complicated. But we all know we simplify things because it allows us to do certain things. It's not fair. I always tell my students, everyone's striving to be more open-minded because you just want to learn things. I said, you're close when you afford someone who's different the same type of latitude and difference that you afford to yourself in your own culture. Which is exactly what you said. We all accept the fact that Americans are at war about what it means to be American, how different people are, the different contributions of different minority groups, and all of that. We allow that to exist. And when you finally reach the point where you allow the Chinese to have that sort of complexity, now you're in a good spot.
That's a great perspective.
The last one was when I finally got to go to Tibet. So, Center College, we got a grant from an organization. It's called the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And we were trying to introduce our faculty to more things about Asia, right? So they could get into the curriculum, and then our psychology classes, right? And our politics classes and our English classes could be more interesting and more diverse. So I said, oh, I know Asia. Y'all come with me. We went on these faculty research trips through Asia. So how these are run is that each faculty has their expertise. So one was actually a well-known national ceramicist.
Ceramicist, that ceramics?
Yeah, ceramics, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So she actually was a well-known potter. I guess we call them potters.
Okay, all right.
The other one was a well-known poet and an English expert on English literature and Shakespeare. And then another one was an expert in politics, international politics. And then we had a well-known multicultural psychologist. So I said, okay, y'all want to go to Tibet? I do. I've never been to Tibet. They said, yeah. And so we found out we could only go through the Chinese approved tourist agency. And so we got all our visas through them. Obviously, we're fed. They allowed us to craft the itinerary a little bit with them, but it was pretty much a set itinerary. But we went to Shanghai first because the ceramicist wanted to do a lot of research in the Shanghai Museum. And then we went to Yunnan, where the beautiful scenery is as well that a lot of classical Chinese poets wrote about. That was for our English professor. And then the other two, we sort of followed their interests slowly along the southern border, up the plateau into Tibet to Lhasa. Mm-hmm. And that's when I had culture shock.
Really? You had culture shock?
Massive culture shock.
You've been around the world, spoke many languages. At this page, you have culture shock.
When you go from southern China to Tibet, it's incredible. I remember climbing the mountain in the van we were in, and all of a sudden, the entire world changed. This architecture completely changed, right? You know the light, ethereal, wooden, curved architecture of the Chinese, and all of a sudden, you are faced right with a block, a massive block, cement block, almost what we think of as like a business building in front of you. And that's a Tibetan architecture that's almost tiered and slanted in like a Mayan temple, right? Like it was just, everything was so different. And then all of a sudden you see animals everywhere, colorful clothing, flags, right? And you have the pyramids everywhere. And it was just the contrast was so stark and almost so immediate. And it was fascinating. And then the smells were different too because they burned so much incense, right? Mm-hmm. I remember when we were in Lhasa, we got up in the morning and it was like constant, just wave after wave, plume after plume of burning pine, juniper, and all these smells. It was just so different.
Wow.
And it was good for me because I had only read and seen movies about Tibet, and to talk to Tibetans, see them struggle and not really want to speak Chinese to me for good reasons. They want to use the English because, speaking Chinese meant something different to them than it did to me, right? Mm-hmm. A white guy from America speaking Chinese was a sign of privilege, right? A Tibetan speaking Chinese, it was forced upon them. So it meant something different to them. And just learning all of that, it was wonderful for me to experience that.
So it sounds like you've had some really interesting experiences that Chinese, it's opened up some of these doors. How did you get into like doing some translation?
So when I was finishing up my PhD, I met a visiting speaker who was out of California. I don't even remember his name anymore. He was the author who translated Huoja into English. And obviously, just like for a lot of us, watching or reading to live left a strong impression on us as a beautiful, beautiful piece of literature. And I got to spend some time talking with him and asked him the same exact question you asked me. Like, well, how'd you get into this? Because you don't get any credit as an academic for translating, mm-hmm. for the most part. Nobody cares. It doesn't help you with your job. And he just said, nah, I kind of did it as a side project as an undergrad and a grad student. And I really enjoyed it. Helped me with my Chinese, et cetera, et cetera. And so I said, yeah, well, I'm going to try this out. So what I started doing is just anytime there was an opportunity or someone asked, hey, can you translate this poem? It started out with poetry. Can you translate this? And I said, yeah. I did that for like 4 years, basically pro bono, everything. Mm. And then at some point, I obviously did something for somebody and connected to a press in China. I found myself on a list of 4 or 5 different major presses in China. And so at that point, these chief editors would start sending me emails. Hey, can you do this book? Can you do this book? And it was kind of a circuitous path because, like I said, it started out with poetry for years. And then all of a sudden, there's presses in Beijing, Nanjing, and Shanghai, a lot of them that are geared towards children's literature and young adult literature. And they got a hold of me, and that's basically been like 80% of my work now. I'm kind of like the go-to for a ton of children's and young adult fiction now.
That's exciting. That's really cool.
But yeah, it took a while. It's pro bono, pro bono, pro bono, pro bono until something happens, right?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
So,
what kind of advice would you give to someone who's learning Chinese right now?
start and then lead with your passions, your internal motivations, always. There's always going to be some test, some credential, right? Some program that you think is going to lead you to where you want to go. But I'll tell you, it was my experience as somebody who needed that internal motivation, that even if you get those things, that credential or pass that HSK 6, or if you go to this, the Tsinghua program or something like that, if it doesn't engage what you're interested in and your passion, I can't guarantee it, but I suspect you'll be disappointed with your progress even. You have to stay true to your motivations and follow those because they'll take you to the right places. And so you need to feed your motivations and you need to feed your soul, or else you're just going to give up.
You said something about you need to focus on like kind of where you want to go, right? Now, looking back, so when you first started learning Chinese back when you were in college versus where you are now, how is where you are now the same or different than what you envisioned where you wanted to go or what you wanted to be back when you first started learning?
It changes. Yeah, it changes. I don't think it negates what I said earlier about knowing your motivations, because those change too. So for me, it was philosophy and literature to begin with. And then I realized that only got me so far. So then it became people, right? Getting to know people. And that was big for me during my Taiwan phase. And then teaching, right? I was really interested in bringing that joy and spark of interest to other people as an instructor. And then I found out at some point that I wanted more than just that one-on-one. I wanted to do something that would have a bigger impact. And that's when I got into writing and authoring and translating. Because I said, you know what? As an academic, even if you write something cool, right, really cool, earth-shattering, you might have 20 or 30 people who read it. Maybe. So I'd put in 2 years of work on this really cool project. It was basically about a wonderful book that was written in Europe in the 1600s about China. No one's ever heard of it, but it was a 600-page novel about the Chinese. It was really fascinating.
Interesting.
Arthurian romance about Chinese knights and all sorts of crazy stuff.
Wow.
I spent years on that. It was great. A handful of people read it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas my side project that I was doing, I was editing the Tang Shi Sanbai Show, right? The 300 Tang Dynasty poems for all the elementary school kids in China. That's what I was doing.
Wow.
That's 100 million people.
Yeah.
So that's when I realized, even the small things that seem insignificant to maybe the academics I was talking to, that's what started to jazz me. Oh, I want to do these things that a lot of people can gain something from.
Well, Kyle, if people want to find more about what you're doing and some of these projects that you're working on, where can they go?
So I have a website called Anderson Translation, but it's written in pinyin. So it's Anderson, Andesen Translation. Anderson Translation.
Ah.
And there's a tab there called New with an exclamation mark. Shinshu, new shoes. New shoes.
New shoe.
There's my Chinglish. New books. New shoes. New book. So click on New, and there's going to be 2 books there that are coming out this year. One is with the Yilin Press out of Nanjing. And that's a translation of a book by Xu Feng, a journalist. And he wrote a memoir of a World War II hero you have never heard of.
Really?
Chen Shoulin, a famous scientist who saved about 100 innocent people from the Nazis while she was studying abroad in Belgium.
Wow.
It's a fascinating story. It's not my best work. That's not what I'm telling you. I'm just telling you because it's a
great
figure
story
in history that you need to know about. There's actually a television series about her.
Oh, really?
She's in their cultural memory, contemporary cultural memory, but no one outside of China knows about her.
Yeah.
Then the other one, I have completed my first personal, what's called a middle grade fantasy fiction novel. completed a novel and it's going to be published. Yeah. It's based on the famous classic of Mountain and Seas, that bestiary about wild. It's a classical Chinese text about crazy wild beasts and creatures in this mythological world. And what I've done basically, for anyone who's familiar with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe or any of these things, where kids go into another world, I've basically written one where we have some Chinese American kids from Brooklyn who find their way into this world of mythological beasts. But it's got some Chinese learning in it because all the creatures in it comes straight out of the Shanhai Jing, that classical text.
Now, just to be clear, this book is in English, right?
This book is in English. Both of these books that I'm telling you about are in English, yeah. One is my translation and one is my actual authored in an English book. My plan is to have it translated into Chinese.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes, so if anyone wants to check out that book, you'll know where to go. And it sounds like you're always working on new things as well, so it's exciting to see some of the things you have coming down the pipeline.
Thanks, Jared. I appreciate it.
Well, Kyle, I really appreciate you taking this time with us, sharing your story and your experiences. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, and good luck to all the listeners. Continue on your path. It's a fabulous, diverse place, China, and then wherever the Chinese end up to, which is all over the world, and their particular cultures, keep studying, keep learning.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, tourists, gamer, marathoner, boxer, dissertation defender, pastor, footballer, translator, and that one gal named Rachel. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at mandarincompanion.com or tag us on social media, #MandarinCompanion. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Kaiser Guo at SupChina, and interview editor is Dominic Edgley. I'd like to thank our guest interview, Kyle Anderson, and of course thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Paston. See you next time.